think there's anything you could do to mitigate that?
Yeah, just be more mindful of what you're consuming online. Maybe spend less time on your phone, more time in nature. Maybe more restrictions to like in China, for example, they have a limit on how much time you can spend on certain social media. So TikTok, it locks up after like 2 minutes. So
everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'm Sarah Ken. I'm the Chief Sustainability Correspondent of Business Fashion. I'm very excited to be having this conversation about the ethics of good looks. It's something I think about a lot. And I'm joined by an incredible panel to talk about this. I've got Professor Dilys Williams, who is the founder and director of the Centre for Sustainable Fashion and also advises the UK policy and the UK government and the UN on sustainable fashion. Justine Porterie, who is the head of sustainability and diversity, equity and inclusion at Depop, which has basically made Resale cool for the entire young generation now, and Tansy Hoskins, who is an award-winning author and journalist who literally wrote several books on this subject. So there is a lot to talk about, but we really have the experts to help us unpack this subject. And, you know, Dilys, I wanted to start by coming to you, because you've been working in the space for a really long time. And I think fashion is not always the top of people's list of sustainability bogeyman. It's not an industry we immediately think about when we think about environmental pollution. So why is it important to have this conversation in the context of fashion?
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Great to be here. I hope we'll have a discussion with everybody in the room, because actually fashion is something that we're all involved in, and that's why it is a really powerful means to think about the context of our time. So whilst you say that fashion isn't thought about as a sort of first port of call when we're thinking about the oil industry, but actually it is the oil industry, and I think there is a really heightened awareness now of all of the kind of concerns around fashion. And I'd like tonight to sort of almost start by saying it's a night of ideas. For all of us, we potentially can imagine an amazing time when we can all be really proud of fashion, proud of what we're wearing, proud of being a professional in fashion. I certainly have to work towards thinking, you know, what is it that I'm doing as a designer? And working with other designers. And maybe we need to sort of flip from kind of starting with a problem, but I will come back to you and I will answer the question, to thinking about imagining what would it take for us to actually all be living well together as humans in a more than human world. And I think fashion is a good place to start, because it's one of the distinctions of being human. We every day make some kind of decision, whether personally or professionally, about what we're going to put on, what it stands for, how it connects us to other people. But we don't necessarily think about, some of us, is that everything in fashion comes from nature. So every single element of everything we're wearing is part of materials from nature, and it's molded by the skills of human hands. So if we're thinking about something that's as precious as soil, as precious as what is around us that grows, and also it's the skills of people. Why is it that we're in this position of, particularly in the UK, and it's interesting being here at the French Institute, a recent report told us that the footprint per person of fashion has to dramatically change. But it's not for everybody. In the top 20 countries of the G20, Australia is actually at the very top of needing to reduce the amount per person that it emits from a carbon perspective, and that's only one element of sustainability. The UK is number 4. We need to reduce in the UK overall as an average down to only a third of our current fashion purchases and fashion use. France actually is number 15. It's almost at the point of living within the 1.5 degree lifestyle. And the countries below that, India, China, Indonesia and Turkey are actually already underneath that. So the myth that everybody needs to change and that everybody has an equal fashion footprint, I think, needs to be busted. But the bottom line is, just from climate change perspective, the fashion industry emits more CO2 emissions than France, Germany and the UK across all industries and all lives put together. It's massive. And when you think about biodiversity loss, it's another conversation again. When you're thinking about the 8 million people that work in the fashion sector, most of them are underneath the minimum national wage in their country. A lot of them are in modern-day slavery. But at the same time, the most wealthy person in the world, a Frenchman, I might say, is the head of a fashion business. So there's a lot of considerations in, yes, good looks, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of the more detail later on. But for me, the starting point for thinking about good looks is, what would nature say that good looks are about? And what maybe would the most vulnerable person in the world say, oh, that looks good in fashion terms? I think we've got a lot to think about and a lot for a lot of us to learn. I trained as a fashion designer. I didn't know about the environmental and social impact of fashion from my training, but 20 years down the line, no, more than 20 years down the line, a lot more, I'm now really proud to say that a lot of the education around fashion does consider that, and a great many designers are thinking about it, and there are lots of great ways in which people are imagining fashion better, but it's completely drowned out by the volumes of the current system that are perpetuating the issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and modern-day slavery.
That was an incredible overview.
Sorry.
No, that was that was amazing. And actually, I think that point you ended on and how the conversation is changing is really interesting. And Tansy, I was curious to hear from you. I know you've been writing about this topic since 2011. How have you seen the conversation evolve, and how do you think about it now compared to when you first started looking at these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it has changed. I mean, I think the fact that we are here having this discussion, at the Night of Ideas, I don't think that would have happened back in sort of 2010, 2011. It was definitely a lot more of a niche subject. Unfortunately, I believe that it took one of the worst sort of industrial homicides of modern history, like the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory buildings in Dhaka, Bangladesh, to put the fashion industry front and center of the sort of overall sustainability conversation. Do I think it should have taken that? Of course not. Like, do I want another thing like that to happen before it gets even more headlines? Absolutely not. So I think, yeah, I mean, as we were saying earlier, like the anniversary of Rana Plaza is actually April of this year. So it is a really important time to reflect on like what has changed and what really hasn't changed. And obviously some things changed in Bangladesh. You had the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which is now being rolled out to become a more sort of regional initiative. But I think structurally, overall, the fashion industry has not changed. People in the fashion industry working in the factories are not paid a living wage. There's really high rates of gender-based violence and harassment. It's like normal for a young woman garment worker to be like slapped at work if she gets something wrong. It's like, when was the last time like any of us could even imagine being slapped at work, if we just like got something wrong or weren't fast enough. So the conditions haven't changed overall. And still, I see the fashion industry as a really central part of this extractive global economy that we have, whereby labor hours, resources, land in the global south is all being extracted and just going to service the biggest, some of the biggest corporations in the global north, your H&Ms and your Zaras and your Primarks and your luxury brands as well. But it's this very extractive model, and that at the moment is not shifting. And that is what I believe we fundamentally need to change the industry.
Are we the problem? Is it the way we shop?
I think the structure of the global economy is the problem. Personally, I think capitalism is the problem, and that we have an extractive model that has been around for centuries. It was there with colonialism, and it was very obvious. You had the enslavement of people, you had taxation, you had armies going in and taking land, from the people it belonged with. Now it's more subtle. It's based on debt. It's based on structural adjustment programs that say, come on, Bangladesh, don't try and be self-sufficient, or come on, Sri Lanka, forget about growing food, come and open 4,000 garment factories and rip up the food and plant tea or plant coffee or plant cotton, and let's export those. 80% of everything Bangladesh exports is garments. It's insane, and that doesn't benefit Bangladesh. That benefits Primark, H&M, blah blah blah.
And it creates a really interesting complexity when we talk about potential solutions, because when you reduce consumption of the clothes we make now, the economies that it impacts are also those economies that have, are most exploited by the industry. But one thing I'm curious to explore a little bit is if things have changed a little bit, but not that much in the last 10 years. Are there new models that are developing? And Justine, I know, Depop is a very interesting example of something that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, but is growing very fast now. And I'm curious to hear what role you think online re-commerce can play in changing this narrative.
I think Resale is one solution among others. It's a great one, but as Tansy has said, as Dilys has said, it's such a systemic problem that we need all hands on deck. So Resale is beautiful in some aspects, and Depop is 11 years old now, so right at that mark. And I think the young generation, so our users, 90% of our users are under 26. So it's really the next generation. They just made secondhand cool. That's how you introduced it. And it's the stigma of buying secondhand in that generation just simply doesn't exist. Those are clothes, and they're actually cool. There's uniqueness to it. You can express yourself, and people won't have the same thing as you, and you can also rework it, upcycle things. So it's an outlay for creativity and self-expression, which is beautiful. And I think decoupling that with newness is what that generation teaches us. And what I really love about Depop and about them, that younger generation, is that they have that power to create a positive ripple effect with other generations. When I talk to people that may be a little older, the Gen X, for instance, and I introduce, I'm working at a resale fashion marketplace. It's called Depop. Sometimes I may have a little look of, okay, and then usually 2 minutes afterwards, I have oh yes, my daughter, she does that all the time, and my son, and then that's how you. What I really love about fashion, and it resonates with what you were saying earlier, Dilys, and why I decided to work on this industry, is because it's such a common factor. Everyone wears clothes. So it's also a great entry point for people to more sustainable living, because it's an easy switch to make. You realize that by shopping on Depop, for instance, you can have the same experience that you have by shopping at your favorite online retailer. I'm not gonna make publicity for anyone else, for new especially. But the point is, you can mirror that experience, And then I like to think that business models like Depop and Resale, but also Repair, if we make those switches so easy and so seamless, that's how we act as Trojan horse for sustainable living. Because you realize that you can get the same dopamine hit and have that feel-good feeling when you buy something. We're not telling you that your life is going to be grim and you're going to have to wear linen and eat, I don't know, like organic potatoes and oatmeal forever. No. And then it's totally fine to like those things. But then when you're in, we then make you realize that you can then apply that to other parts of your life. And then you might think, oh, actually, I need a new sofa or I need new furniture. Why couldn't I get those secondhand as well? Because there's so much stuff out there. Then let's try to do with what we have.
Dilys, you started by pointing out that in order to live within a 1.5 degree framework in the UK, we have to drastically reduce how many clothes we buy. How do you see resale fitting into that picture? If we just shift to shopping secondhand, can we keep shopping in the same way, or does there need to be more changes as well?
Thank you. As Justine said, it's one really important aspect, and I mean, I think what you're saying, not only about the fact that it starts to socialize a different perspective about value and extending the value of things and seeing things as having more than one life, which is great. At the moment, though, we've kind of got two different things going on. We've got Depop, we've got all sorts of other small businesses. In fact, over 99% of fashion businesses are small businesses. And I get very excited because a lot of the young designers are doing incredible things. And we have got fashion otherwise. We have got these great possibilities that we can see in front of us. But as I said, at the moment, it's drowned out by the volume of everything else. And at the moment, unfortunately, the statistics show us that people are buying secondhand and. So they're not switching from new to secondhand. They're buying secondhand and they're still buying new. So as you said, if we reduce down to buying a third of what we're buying and only buying secondhand, that would make a huge difference. But at the moment, we're not quite seeing that shift. We're kind of almost at the tipping point. People are saying they care. People are actually starting to choice edit. And every brand knows that. Every brand knows that they are in a very vulnerable position if they're not credible. But at the moment, there's a total license to exploit people and nature. There's nothing either in legislation or in social acceptability, which means actually we are all kind of complicit in it because we're still letting it happen. And again, because I'm in French Institute, I'm putting in my little... So Camus talks about rebellion as being the simultaneous action of negating what you cannot no longer stand for and amplifying the things that you believe in. So I think we have to really amplify the things we believe in, but we've absolutely got to choice edit and not be socially acceptable around the stuff that really is destroying the planet and exploiting us, and not really making a very good kind of representation of what we are as humans, because fashion is a bellwether of the world and what's going on. And if we look out around us, then actually the signs are not great. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No,
it does.
Fantastic. Another fantastic overview. And I'm curious. We've talked a lot about what the challenges are, also opportunities, but why are we not seeing this change? Tansy, what is it that needs to happen to actually make some of these shifts we're talking about happen?
Yeah, I mean, like some kind of law about something in supply chains would be nice. Like the fashion industry is really, really like the Wild West. at the moment. You know, it's like it's subcontracted, it's totally deregulated. Brands just kind of hop from country to country and city to city and factory to factory, just sort of flouting rules and regulations. So, you know, I would love to see like any kind of like global regulation that dictates how people in fashion supply chains can be treated, how the planet within fashion supply chains can be treated. And I would love to see that legislation have teeth. You know, I would like to see some of these CEOs held accountable. I think a lot of them should be on trial, and a lot of them, frankly, should be in prison for some of the things that they've done and the things that have happened to people in supply chains. And, you know, the rivers that have been declared biologically dead from, you know, leather effluent, you know, and the rainforest. A little known fact, the number one cause of Amazon deforestation is cattle farming for, you know, bones and meat and leather, and 50% of everything that's made from leather is shoes. So again, you know, there's like direct links to some of the biggest ecological problems that we have at the moment. So yeah, some legislation would be nice. I think it's also critically important that there is the right for workers in the garment industry to self-organize. The number of trade unions in the garment industry is still very, very low. You take a country like Guatemala, there's only 2 unionized factories. You know, we're still seeing extremely high levels of violence against trade unionists and against workers who go out on strike and stand up for themselves. Both violence from factory owners and the thugs that they hire, but also state violence. You know, because these countries are in the position whereby they have to earn foreign currency, and that depends upon them keeping this climate, this brand-friendly climate where, you know, the pesky workers don't make any trouble and just churn out this stuff. And yeah, I mean, personally, I'm also very worried that the fashion industry is also becoming more authoritarian. You know, obviously in Myanmar, where, you know, it's now under like very draconian military rule, but also, you know, in Sri Lanka, a big garment exporter, like the role of the military there is very, very, very worrying.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment in time where we are seeing some governments engage more with regulation, creating new opportunities, but at the same time, the state of the world is such that in many cases, the predicament that workers face is getting worse and more precarious. You know, Justine, I'm curious from your perspective if there are any pieces of legislation that you're looking at specifically that you see as creating opportunities.
Yes. The thing that I can't stop banging about is extended producer responsibility.
Can you unpack what that is?
Which means, well, if the audience is mainly French, it will resonate, but it's the principle of polluter payer. So that has been applied in packaging. So anyone who produces packaging pays a levy and a tax, and that then funds the sorting and the recycling of packaging. Just applying that to fashion. The problem that we have is a volume. Well, we have so many problems, as Dilys has expertly explained. But yeah, just to give you a sense of volumes, we're talking about between, depending on the research, like 80 to 150 billion garments produced each year. We're going to reach 9 billion people, or we may have. But so each year there's so many, we can dress ourselves so many times. And we don't wear those clothes. A lot of them are never sold. And no one is held accountable for this. And no one is held accountable for what happens with this waste. So France has actually been leading the charge there, and a scheme of extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is being developed and rolled out there. But we basically need that everywhere. And we also need, very important, but we can't have everything at the same time, but consistency across countries to help brands align and make sure that they can do that on a large scale. Because if we want the system to be truly circular, we need to be able to reuse all those precious materials that you've said before. Like, all of this comes from our soil. Those are non-renewable resources. We're using the soil that we could be using to feed people to grow cotton, and then think that all that work that got into it, all those resources, all those pesticides that have been used, if that garment is not used and end up in a landfill or unworn or worse, all of that will happen for nothing. So how can we make sure that this piece is worn as long as possible, and then at the end of its life that it can be repurposed and can be turned into a new textile so that we truly have a loop? The reality is, right now, only about 1% of textile is recycled from textile to textile. So we need the funds for this, and EPR is an option that helps us to get there. So yeah, if there was one thing, if I had a magic wand, this is what I would ask for.
I think that's a really good point. We haven't actually talked much about what happens to clothes once they're not wanted anymore, because a lot of stuff does not get resold; it gets shipped abroad, and we don't have the technology yet at scale to actually recycle stuff back into the system. And so EPR schemes that could fund that are, really interesting, or, also potentially just changing the materials we use so that they can be recycled. And, Dilys, I know you've been engaging a lot on policy, and I'm curious where you see the conversations going and where you see the most engagement.
Yeah. Thank you. Along with Justine, I'm very excited about extended producer responsibility as well, because as soon as a brand realizes they've got to pay for their pollution, then actually it changes the cost system for them, and they then start to rethink about what it means to make profit, and they start to factor in the cost to nature, the cost to human dignity. So there's a number of different pieces of legislation that are being talked about. Again, as Justine said, in France and across the EU, zero textiles to landfill is coming through. The extended producer responsibility on packaging, which will then hopefully be rolled out beyond just being about zero textiles to landfill. The Modern Slavery Act, which started with the California Act, actually, the UK has a Modern Slavery Act. It needs more teeth, a lot more teeth. But even though the UK hasn't actually taken on some of those laws yet, although they have got the ones they slavery, anybody who is producing and exporting to Europe will have to make sure they combine with those laws, and anybody importing will need to as well. So it actually does mean that it makes a big change in this country as well, which is great. I've literally just come from, there's the UN after COP15, when we started talking about the 1.5 degree warming as the maximum. I mean, we're still trying to hold on to that, and the UN looked at 3 or 4 different sectors that had a really big impact, not just in their own business, but also a wider kind of impact on society, as you were talking about, sort of cultures and habits, and fashion's one of them. So the United Nations Fashion Charter for Climate Action is an incredible group of people who are looking at everything from phasing out coal in certain production companies, phasing out oil, phasing out oil-based materials, and looking at every element of the system. And so legislation around all of those elements is really necessary, and working with governments in different countries depending on what their issue is. If it's about how do we get renewables, and how do we actually get governments to incentivize renewables rather than incentivizing more coal mines. Don't get me started on that one either. But so legislation around supporting the switch from oil and the switch from coal, legislation around modern-day slavery and workers' rights and the ability to unionize, legislation around volume has to come in at some point. And actually, it's not about telling businesses they can't have livelihoods, because the fashion industry is an incredible livelihood. But it hasn't always been like this. I'm old enough to remember when the fashion industry wasn't like this, and people were not buying as much. In the last 15 years, people have been buying twice as much as they bought 15 years ago, and only wearing things for 36%, I think it is, of the time that they used to wear them for. Hasn't always been like that, even though it's always been an amazing industry. So we can change it. A lot of the online companies know they need to change it. Some of the online retailers are having 70% returns on some of the garments they sell, because people are buying every size, every colour, getting them home, using their home as a changing room, and then either sending them back or discarding them. And that doesn't make any sense on any level. As you said, if it's land that's being used for making clothes that nobody wears, it's completely out of sync with any kind of sense of rationality, aside from business sense. So we are starting to see some change, and some of the forerunners are starting to model actually how they can have a profitable business. But until we factor in the environmental, social and cultural cost alongside the economic cost, we're not actually going to have a level playing field. And that's why we do need legislation. We need everybody to actually choice edit, and we also need to think about what it means to be a designer. I work with designers and students all the time. I've never come across anybody that said, oh, I really want to exploit people, I really want to be a part of climate change. And so if you have integrity as a designer, you are going to be looking out for these things. Knowledge is power, and once you know, you can't unknow. And that is going to change things as well. And some of these big businesses find that some of our graduates don't want to work for them. So without the talent and the great designers, a business dries up as well.
I think that is such an interesting point, and I could keep talking about that for a long time, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. So if there are any questions, now is your chance. Yes, I think there's a microphone coming your way.
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much for the talk so far. I think a lot of what you've been discussing has been about kind of volume within the fashion industry, and there are some brands like Primark, H&M, Zara, who sell a lot at very low prices, and that obviously has really detrimental environmental impacts. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well on the role that like luxury fashion brands have to play in terms of influencing fashion trends, and are there any examples of luxury fashion brands that are doing a good job of promoting sustainability? Because my impression is even at that level, there are still examples of fashion brands, that really are still extremely wasteful. I think there was one brand that up until recently was still burning any leftover products that weren't sold. I think they no longer do that, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
That is a fantastic question. Dilys, do you want to take that first?
Thank you. Yeah, it is a great question. I mean, I don't know any business in the fashion industry, whether they're a volume retailer or luxury, that are not thinking about this. And I quite agree that the luxury sector are part of a sort of aspiration, and so they have a particular responsibility and a particular role to play. And there is some good work being done, but I would say that a lot of the focus around the kind of the detrimental elements of fashion have been seen as being at the lower end, the lower price point end, as if it's kind of the mantra of, oh, poor people need cheap clothes, which kind of just shows the intersectionality of discrimination from race, class, gender, and I think it's really important to remember that the top 20% of earners have 20 times the emissions per person than the rest of the population. And so those people that are buying both luxury, and they're not always just buying luxury. So there's, I think, a conversation around the luxury sector, and there's also a conversation around high earners and how they're spending money. But the examples I can give of good work that the luxury sector is doing is, we work quite a bit with Kering, and they do a lot of work across the idea of, they've got a big fund around biodiversity, and they're looking at issues to do with biodiversity loss because they're in with some of the rare animal fibres. It's a particular issue, and they're very aware of that. They also actually were the brand that worked to develop something called the environmental profit and loss, and they've also developed the social profit and loss. So there are these models that businesses can use to look at both the economic and the environmental and the social price tag of what they're doing. So I think that is an example. LVMH are doing some really interesting things as well. They're all doing quite interesting things, but I think they're all still bound up in this idea of selling more stuff, whether it's at very high level or not. And I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done. And the idea of something that's really precious and cherished, and maybe some of these brands actually have to limit the amount they're making. Maybe actually that would make these things more precious, because luxury was, by definition, it's about something that's rare and to be cherished. So I think the definition of luxury maybe needs to be re-looked at, not redefined, because actually the definition's fine, but what is touted as luxury fashion is maybe needs to be put up against that benchmark of rare and cherished.
Tansy, you go ahead and then, or
No, I was just to add what Dilys was saying. I don't make that much of a distinction between sort of high street fashion and like high end fashion. I think you've got to remember that like a lot of what like the like luxury brands sell is like tat. So like, people don't buy, the luggage, they don't buy the couture dress. They go and buy like the lipstick or the perfume or the pair of sunglasses or the horrible t-shirt or the belt with the buckle on it. Like most of what these brands are churning out is like not luxury. It's not high, it's not good design. It's like, it's plastic wrapped stuff. So yeah, I generally don't draw much of like a distinction. I also think this point is really important. Like luxury gets such a pass. And there's this ridiculous idea that people who buy luxury clothes have just buy one thing a year or have this little carbon footprint and stuff, where it's like it's part of a life where it's your private jets or your international travel and your holidays in like the Caribbean and probably a couple of cars on the driveway. That's something. For me, it shouldn't exist. Like we cannot afford for that sector to exist in the the crisis, the ecological crisis that we're in at the moment. And the luxury sector is as much a sign of the devastating inequality of this world, which is the ultimate kind of cause of climate change. For me, it's as much of a sign of the problems that we have as the £2 bikini from Boohoo, but we put all the attention on the little bit and let the big guns, the richest men in the world, just get away with so much.
Just to add to both of your points with the resale lens on, I think resale is only a solution, as much of a solution, if there's displacement. So you alluded to that earlier. It means that you can celebrate resale if it means you're not going to buy something else instead. And I'm happy to work for a company where our displacement is high. So it means that 9 out of 10 purchases on Depop do displace the buyer of something new. When you look at others, and the more luxury ones, it dropped dramatically. So I think, as you were saying, I like the idea of luxury pieces being investment pieces, and that's kind of how it used to be, right? And that's what I love about resale to some extent, because some people may not be able to actually afford some of those higher quality pieces that are going to last for a long time. And with the democratization of resale, now you can invest for the same price as a Zara or an H&M coat, which those things are not cheap. You can buy a better quality piece secondhand and then keep it. So there is a role, but the reality is that most consumers in the luxury segments are not just going to buy one. So I'm all for, and there are a number of brands that are trialing circular business models, and that I absolutely love and encourage. And we work with a number of brands who do that and who then go on and then embed those business models in their way of working, which is incredible. Now, for me, the next step is to look at to what extent those new business models that you embed do displace new, because otherwise it means you're actually greenwashing, right? You're just, which I assume most people have heard this term before, but it means you're just putting a nice layer that looks green and then make you more appealing, but underneath you have not really changed how the engine works. So I think as citizens, as I don't like the word consumers, so as citizens who sometimes buy things, you can challenge that and you can look into this, and the more we ask questions, the more then it's being talked about at the top table. So yeah, I would encourage you to use your voice.
Thank you for such a great and thought-provoking question. I think there was another question over here.
Does this work? Yeah. Hi, I wanted to ask a question that was sort of very much related to where we are at the Institut Français, and think about Paris's role in fashion. And I kind of wanted to pick up on what Tansy was saying about the role of luxury. Surely there is something that the Fédération Française de la Couture could do at this point to actually support all the values that are needed if we were to talk about the ethics of fashion. I mean, why does haute couture, in the way it does, still exist? If we look at the disgusting Schiaparelli show that we've just seen, I mean, why is there not some form of regulation within the Fédération Française that exists? Because otherwise, what is the point of having a federation? And also, why do we continue in fashion to support a system that totally glorifies extreme wealth?
That is also a great question. And just to contextualize for people who might not have caught the Schiaparelli show that you were talking about, in the haute couture show 2 weeks ago, there were a series of dresses sent down the runway designed to look like very lifelike heads of wild animals, glorifying trophy hunting. And it was very, although they were entirely fake, it was, caused a lot of debate and was very scandalizing for the industry, I think. We don't have a representative of FHCM here tonight, but I don't know if anyone feels in a position to answer that.
Well, a fantastic question. You're probably actually a better person to answer that question, Jackie. Maybe I'll put it back to you and say, what do you think? I mean, absolutely. If there's not an ethical code of conduct for our industry, I mean, there needs to be an ethical code of conduct in terms of the kind of messaging that's going out. We already know as well all sorts of things, whether it's to do with model size, whether it's to do with the materials that are being used, etc. The moment, I think we've probably got more power as citizens to stand up against these things and to say how horrified we are. And I think somehow we've become anaesthetised. You know, a few years ago, there was an incredible campaign that was the anti-fur campaign, the Lynx campaign, that was taking models down the runway, actually showing the cruelty to animals in really explicitly. And a lot of people stopped wearing fur, stopped wearing animal skins because of it. And I think maybe because there's so many different things that we're concerned about, so many different issues and we've kind of become used to accepting some of these things. And the wealth-poverty divide is, as Tansy said, that's the big one. As humans, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we're all born as equals, and yet actually we're not, are we? So the extreme wealth and how it is displayed and how it is normalized is something that I think inside fashion and beyond fashion we need to all of us stand up against. And the Paris shows, I was surprised at how little was actually said in the press. I mean, this also goes back to you, Sarah. Maybe I can ask you a question now I've got the microphone. So what's the role of the media in this?
That also is a great question. I mean, I think the fashion press lives in a very conflicted space, because as we were talking about at the very start of this conversation, historically fashion hasn't been viewed as an industry on many levels. I think from a policy perspective, policymakers haven't really paid that much attention, and the press, by and large, though, Tansy, we were talking about how, you were one of the first to really change this paradigm. The press has not covered fashion as an industry. They've covered it as almost a sort of an industry they have a very cozy relationship with. A lot of coverage of the industry is done by through magazines who live off advertising revenue, and there's a lot of conflicts there. And that I think has enabled a lot of the lack of accountability in the industry. But I do really see that changing as the conversation around the industry's impact has grown, and I think there is a lot more rigorous coverage of the sector now, and there's a lot more, brands get a lot more questions from journalists than they used to. Definitely there could be more, and I think a lot of the way the industry is talked about still skews very strongly towards a very Western perspective, and so much of the issues happen outside of the Western markets where they are most talked about, and so there's so many opportunities to keep improving it. Tansy, I'm curious if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think definitely coverage of the fashion industry has got a lot better. I think it's grown up. I think it wasn't doing its job like a decade ago at all. Just really sycophantic and unhealthy and uncritical and just not talking about this stuff. So I for one am relieved to see, that Business of Fashion has like a chief sustainability lead, and Jasmine Chur over at the Sourcing Journal and stuff like this, and people at New York Times and Guardian, like people really, because obviously there were people like Lucy Siegel, we have to name check her, and who were doing this job, but you were really fringe. And I remember feeling really fringe, and so I'm really happy now that it's not. But I'd like to spectate, if I can have like 1 minute just to talk, why do we accept this vast disparity between rich and poor and right and wrong? And I think we've mentioned Camus. I'd like to just briefly touch on Marx's theory of alienation, because I think this is really critical, and I think the treatment of animals within the fashion industry really goes to the heart of the climate crisis as well, because I think capitalism has taught us to be alienated from ourselves, from the planet, from our fellow human beings, to the point where we think that the point of the planet is that it's a resource for us to exploit. We think animals are there to be like dominated and killed and skinned and worn as like symbols of power. And I just think this is so far. And I'm not here talking about like indigenous production. I'm talking about London, Paris, Milan, and New York, and so on. And I think this this comes down to the way our relationship with our bodies, with the planet, with other people, with animals, with nature has been completely skewed. But I think if we can kind of recognize that and reclaim that and reject that and get back to a more holistic thing where we see our place as as one with the other creatures that we spend our time on this planet with, and as one with the planet, then we wouldn't countenance like the fur trade and that horrible fashion show that is just kind of a symbol of power. Like, look how good I am, I can kill these animals and stick them on my body. Like, great, good for you. Off we go into climate disaster.
I think one of the really fascinating things that happened after that show, or related to that show, was it was right around the same time as Lunar New Year, and a lot of brands had come out with advertising campaigns around rabbits, because it's the year of the rabbit, and Gucci in particular, who was early to say they would no longer use fur, put out a campaign with lots of very cute bunnies in it, and a few people noticed that they were still making rabbit felt hats, which, though technically felt is not a fur, in order to make it you do need to kill the animal. And it just points to that sort of juxtaposition where sort of brands are blurring the lines between what they believe is socially acceptable. And I think, episodes like the Schiaparelli show help draw attention to where consumers' bounds of acceptability have shifted, and do actually shine a really interesting spotlight on that for the industry.
Can I just say one thing? One of the most horrible articles I ever had to write was on Angora, and I had to watch these videos of like Angora and how they, they basically rip it out of the animal, out of the rabbit's fur, body, and PETA had done these, this sort of expose. If you've got a strong stomach and you want to be put off Angora for life, go and watch a video of a rabbit being harvested. It's like appalling.
Yeah, because in fact they don't actually kill the animal; they do it while the animal's alive.
Yeah, it's just vile.
But coming back to your point about the fashion weeks and the role that they have, I mean, I think one thing that this situation is actually creating is a means for like-minded people to come together, because everybody knows that one organisation is not going to be able to make enough of a difference. And there is now a European Fashion Alliance, which is all the fashion weeks in Europe, actually talking about how they can be a beacon for an industry that we can be proud of, because everybody knows that we can't at the moment be proud of the industry. So how do we get beyond that, actually, by working together? So there are some coalitions, and within media. I mean, we've worked with Condé Nast and literally got every single Vogue editor from around the world into a room to say, what do you care about? What is it that you value? What is it you think about? What keeps you awake at night? And the messages that they are portraying through their magazine was something that they were really acutely aware of. And, the dilemma of being, the industry only works if they've got advertisers, and the advertisers exert incredible pressure. But what we did was we created a glossary of terms around sustainability, because there's a load of rubbish that's said, and misrepresentation of terms. So we worked with them to have a rigorous set of definitions that they themselves felt were usable, because we didn't want to be too kind of academic about it. We wanted to create something that people could use together. And we found that series of terms is really useful, because when people talk about particular things and they look, okay, this is actually what that means, whether it's the definition of luxury or the definition of sustainability as a means to be able to create an ongoing interdependence between things. And Tansy was talking about, we are interdependent with nature. We are part of nature, not separate from it. So some of these definitions, when you start to think about this idea of being human in a more than human world, and it changes our perceptions. I mean, that is the crisis. The crisis is our crisis, going back to the night of ideas, of imagination. We can't imagine getting beyond this mechanistic, rationalist notion of exploiting nature and exploiting each other. So it's also up to all of us to kind of imagine differently, I think.
Thank you for such a thought-provoking question. You really set us off. I think, do we have time for one more question?
Unfortunately, it's coming to the end.
I'm sorry, we're coming to the end. I might just leave it by asking, we've talked a lot about the complexity and the challenges here, but I wonder if each of you could kind of close by sharing a vision for what, a better fashion system might look like.
Well, I think there's lots of examples out there if you go and look for them. So this isn't something where we are in a position of having to start from scratch. But again, to take Max von Neef talks about this idea of inverting the world as being economic-centered to being ecologically centered. Instead of fashion being at the service of life should be at the service. No, instead of the other way around. Okay, let me rephrase that. Instead of us actually pursuing economic growth, destroying the planet for the sake of fashion, how can fashion be something that helps us all to thrive? And a term that I use in my work is, if the fashion system had an ecological heart, if it had a just mind and it had a diverse body, then the economics just becomes the muscle to help it to work. So yeah, earth and equity first, and then livelihoods and the economic system. It's not that we want to say it's not important, but it should be at the service of life instead of the other way around. Oh, sorry.
How do I do after this, Dilys? Thank you. I tend to go back to the next generation and how they do inspire me every day. And when things are a bit hard, I remember of all of our young users who just live and breathe those new models and those new ways of consuming and being. And yes, there's the rise of ultra-fast fashion, and they also buy that. But they are also at the forefront of fighting and embodying that change. And there are those who are creating those new companies, the rental business, the repair businesses, that to me are the future of fashion. So I really I'm inspired by those, and especially the young entrepreneurs who are no longer, as you were saying, Dilys, like I love that some of those young designers are like, no, actually, I don't want to go work for that big company. I'm just going to do my thing. And my generation, the millennials, I feel like we worked within the boundaries of the system and then tried to change the system from inside and fight to have a seat at the table and then advocate for change. They're like, I don't care about your table. I'm just going to go do my thing and build my table, and it will be way better. So I think we can all champion those values and that mindset and be that change. So yeah, next generation.
Cool. Yes, so much. I mean, yes, I think it's very, very clear that we need to radically overhaul our consumption habits and our, everything to do with clothing in the global north. And I fully support. Repair, exchange, swapping free stuff, so important. I think we just also have to recognise, which obviously we all here do, is that when we change in the global north, it will have seismic consequences for 80 odd million garment workers. So I think my thing would be to be putting the people in the factories at the heart of any transition, at the heart of a global Green New Deal for fashion, just to make sure that we don't repeat the injustices of climate change and create these kind of sacrifice zones where we're like, oh, you know, you can just, you know, go and sink beneath the seas, but that we actually have a solution that's going to work for everyone. And, you know, it's not like, it's not sexy, but it's like we've got to have debt justice in there. You know, we've got to be tackling the IMF and the World Bank and these structural adjustment programs and ending this ridiculous, endless export economy. But the good thing is that there's already loads of great organisations doing that, right? So loads of people to follow. You definitely should send to sustainable fashion. There's like a War on Want, Clean Clothes campaign, Labour Behind the Label, Asia Floor Wage Alliance. I think that's the good news, is there's loads of like groups already doing really important, really good work. So yeah, come join in the fight.
Well, thank you all so much for such an amazing conversation. I think you've left us with a lot to think about, and thank you all for staying to sit through it. Really appreciate it, and thank you guys.